American ballot. Nancy Pelosi figured this would be just another routine takedown on CNN. She had done it 100 times before, sitting under those perfect studio lights with cameras closing in, all set to demolish Trump's new intelligence director in front of a live audience, and millions watching at home. She had labeled Tulsi as compromised, branded her a Russian asset, and even dared to question the loyalty of a combat veteran who served 3 deployments. But there was one thing Pelosi didn't know. Tulsi Gabbard had just spent a solid month poring over every single classified file, and she came with receipts. So, what happened next? What followed was the most brutal 90 minutes of live television ever put on the air. It was a political queen facing off against a warrior who came with documentation, and only one of them would be left standing. The documents Tulsi revealed didn't just serve to defend her. They laid bare decades of corruption that Nancy Pelosi was sure had been buried for good. There were stock trades, war votes, and CIA torture memos, all of it time-stamped, sourced, and impossible to deny. You're about to watch as the most powerful woman in Congress realizes, in real time, that she has walked right into a trap that had been carefully set for weeks. This wasn't just politics. This was a reckoning. The CNN studio lights had that special kind of intensity. You know, the kind television producers absolutely love. The one that can make anyone look like a saint or a sinner, all depending on the camera angle. And on this night, Nancy Pelosi had arranged herself to get the full halo effect. She settled into the guest chair at the George Washington University Town Hall with the kind of comfort that comes from spending 4 decades perfecting the image of power. Her back was straight, but not stiff. Her hands folded, but not tight. And her face showed deep seriousness without looking rehearsed. The audience of 300 filled the auditorium, buzzing with that electric feeling you get when you know you're about to see someone get taken apart. Live on television, Democrats were positioned in the front rows, their hands already getting ready to applaud. Republicans were dotted through the crowd, just hoping their new director of national intelligence could withstand what they all knew was coming. But Tulsi Gabbard walked onto that stage with a completely different kind of energy. There was no big entrance, not even a glance at the cameras, just the disciplined posture of a soldier, sharpened over 3 deployments where one wrong step could get people killed. She wore a dark suit, an American flag pin, and her hands were empty, except for one single leather portfolio. She sat down across from Pelosi with the kind of calm you only see in someone who has been in much more dangerous situations. And if the former speaker even noticed that Tulsi wasn't the least bit nervous, she didn't let on. Jake Tapper started things off with the usual opening about challenges to national security, but everyone in that room knew the real reason they were there. CNN had advertised this as a night of tough questions for Trump's controversial intelligence choice, and they brought in Nancy Pelosi herself to deliver the final blow. For years, the former speaker had been calling Tulsi a Russian pawn. She had questioned her loyalty, her judgment, and whether she was fit to hold any position of power. Tonight was supposed to be the moment that story was set in stone. What Nancy Pelosi didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Tulsi Gabbard had spent the last month as Director of National Intelligence, reading every classified file, every intelligence report, and every single document related to congressional oversight and foreign policy decisions. She had seen things. She had documented those things, and she had been waiting for this exact moment. "Speaker Pelosi," Tapper began, "you've been quite vocal about your concerns over Director Gabbard's past statements on Syria and Russia. Would you care to speak about those concerns directly?" Pelosi didn't even let Tapper finish his sentence. She leaned in with the rehearsed look of sympathy, like a grandmother about to explain some disappointing behavior to a child who'd gone astray. Jake, I believe it's time we were honest with the American people about what we are witnessing in this administration. Director Gabbard has a disturbing track record of repeating Russian propaganda, of meeting with dictators, and of second-guessing our own intelligence community at every opportunity. Her voice had that flawless mix of sadness and strength that had made her a legend. I once called her a rising star when she first arrived in Congress. I truly believed in her potential, but she has demonstrated such consistently bad judgment, such a readiness to echo the talking points of our enemies, that I simply cannot remain silent in good conscience. A murmur went through the crowd as Democrats nodded in agreement, while the cameras zoomed in on Tulsi's face, expecting to see a flash of anger or a defensive look. What they saw instead was something that made the producers in the control booth sit up straight. It was a slight smile, the kind of smile that says someone just fell for a trap you've been setting for weeks. "You brought up my meeting with Assad," Tulsi said, her voice filled with the steady calm of someone who's read casualty reports while under enemy fire. That meeting was looked into by the Office of Congressional Ethics. They found no violations. The purpose of that meeting was very clear. You need to understand all sides before sending more Americans to their deaths. You also met with Assad, didn't you, Speaker Pelosi? In 2007, Pelosi's carefully composed expression flickered for just a split second. That was an official congressional delegation. President Bush at the time said you shouldn't go. He said you were legitimizing a dictator. His exact words. Tulsi's voice remained steady, no change in tone, no rise in volume, no hint of anger, just facts delivered with surgical precision. So when you did it, that was diplomacy. When I did it 10 years later, that's treason. Help me understand the difference. The energy in the room shifted, like the air pressure dropping right before a storm. Republicans sat up straighter. The Democrats suddenly looked a lot less comfortable, and Nancy Pelosi made her first critical mistake. She escalated. "I went as Speaker of the House with decades of experience," Pelosi said, her voice rising with a slight edge of irritation. "You went as a junior congresswoman making propaganda videos for a war criminal. You questioned whether Assad used chemical weapons. You spread Russian disinformation about biolabs in Ukraine. You called for Ukraine to surrender to Putin." Each accusation was delivered with increasing force, building to a crescendo she had clearly practiced. Hillary Clinton was right to raise concerns about your loyalties. You are compromised, Director Gabbard, and the American people deserve to know it. The word compromised hung in the air like an accusation of murder. This wasn't a policy disagreement anymore. It was a question of loyalty, of patriotism, of honor. And Tulsi Gabbard, a combat veteran who volunteered for deployment when she could have stayed safe in her state legislature seat, whose first task each morning in Iraq was reading the list of Americans killed in action, and whose service record was unblemished across 3 deployments, that same Tulsi Gabbard leaned forward with eyes that had calculated threats on presidential motorcades and said quietly, "Compromised." "That's a strong accusation, Speaker Pelosi." She opened her leather portfolio with a deliberate, almost theatrical slowness. "Since you've questioned my integrity on national television, I believe the American people deserve a full conversation about what compromised actually looks like. Don't you agree?" Tapper tried to intervene. As he began, "Director Gabbard, we should probably," Tulsi immediately countered. "Jake, the speaker just accused me of betraying my country. I believe I'm entitled to respond fully." Tulsi's eyes never left Pelosi's face. You wouldn't want to silence someone you've just called compromised, would you, Speaker? That would make it look like you can't even defend your own accusations. Pelosi's face revealed the rapid calculation happening behind her eyes. She had a choice: back down and look weak, or let this continue and risk the outcome, despite having destroyed opponents far stronger than this former Congresswoman. Of course, say what you need to say. And with those words, Nancy Pelosi sealed her own fate. Let's talk about Syria since you brought it up, Tulsi said, producing documents from her portfolio with an efficiency that showed she'd organized them for this exact moment. You said I questioned whether Assad used chemical weapons in specific incidents. That's correct. You know who else questioned those specific incidents? She held up a document, its official seal clearly visible even to the cameras. The Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. Their own inspectors found evidence that was tampered with in the Duma incident. Leaked internal documents showed they were being pressured to change their conclusions. Their own scientists said the evidence simply didn't support the official narrative. She placed 3 more documents on the table between them, each one landing with a weight of evidence Nancy Pelosi had clearly not expected to face. Here's the OPCW whistleblower report. Here is the testimony from the inspectors. And here are the leaked emails showing the pressure campaign. All of it now declassified. All of it now public record. So, when you claim I was spreading Russian propaganda, I was actually asking the very same questions the UN's own weapons inspectors were asking. But you didn't ask those questions, did you, Speaker? You accepted the intelligence at face value, just like you did with Iraq. The room went dead quiet. The Democrats, who had been ready to cheer on their champion, were suddenly not so sure which way this was heading. You voted to authorize the Iraq War in 2002, Tulsi continued, her voice still controlled but now carrying an edge. The sound of someone who had seen the consequences of that vote up close. Based on intelligence about weapons of mass destruction that turned out to be completely false. That war killed 4,500 American service members, wounded 32,000 more, cost over $2 trillion, destabilized the entire Middle East, and created the very conditions for ISIS to exist. She paused, letting that sink in. I was in Iraq, Speaker Pelosi. I worked in a medical unit. Every single morning, my day began by going through casualty reports, name by name, reading about the Americans who had lost their lives because of intelligence you accepted without a second thought. So, you'll have to forgive me if I insist on asking the hard questions before we jump into another war founded on shaky intelligence. Pelosi scrambled to regain her footing. That war, she countered, was based on intelligence the whole of Congress believed back then. Bernie Sanders voted against it. Barbara Lee voted against it. A lot of people questioned it. But you voted for it. And after that, you supported keeping it going. Then, you backed the regime change in Libya, which led to a failed state complete with open slave markets. And on top of that, you supported arming Syrian rebels, whose weapons fell right into the hands of ISIS. Every time a vote for war comes up, you vote yes. Every time there's a request for more military spending, you vote yes. The defense budget now sits at $886 billion, more than the next 10 countries put together. But somehow, we can't seem to afford health care, education, or taking care of our veterans. Tulsi's voice carried the controlled fury of someone who'd held one too many dying soldiers. Where does all that money go? Speaker Pelosi, who exactly is profiting from these endless wars? She then pulled out another document. Let's have a look at your top campaign donors. From Lockheed Martin employees, $146,000. From Boeing employees, 125,000. And from Northrop Grumman employees, 98,000. These are companies that make a profit from the very wars you vote to approve. An interesting pattern. This is nothing but a smear campaign, Pelosi began to say, but Tulsi was already reaching for her next folder, her momentum building like an avalanche just beginning its descent. All right, let's talk about Russia, since you're the one who keeps bringing it up. You claimed that I was spreading disinformation about Ukrainian biolabs, so let me be perfectly clear about what I actually said. She held up a printout of her own tweet, enlarged for the cameras to see. I said that the U.S. has biological research facilities inside Ukraine. That is true. The U.S. Embassy's own website listed them. And here is the archived screenshot. I said that they needed to be secured so that dangerous pathogens wouldn't fall into the wrong hands in the middle of a war. Now, that's just common sense, not propaganda. And then you have Victoria Nuland, the Undersecretary of State, testifying before Congress. And I quote, "We have biological research facilities, and we're worried about them being captured." So either she's spreading Russian propaganda, or I was simply stating documented facts. Pelosi's expression had shifted from confident to careful, the look of someone realizing they may have seriously underestimated their opponent. You called for Ukraine to surrender. I called for diplomacy, for negotiations, for de-escalation. I said that Ukraine should remain neutral instead of joining the NATO military alliance. And do you know who else suggested that Ukraine remain neutral? It was Ukraine's own president, right before the war started. You know who really benefited from an endless war in Ukraine? The very same defense contractors who fund your campaigns and whose stocks your husband just so happens to invest in with incredible timing. Tulsi's voice then dropped, becoming quieter, but infinitely more dangerous. We'll get to your husband's investment genius in a little bit. By now, the audience was completely silent. This was not going the way anyone had expected it to. The interrogation had turned into something else entirely. So, you want to talk about Putin and Russia? Fine, let's talk about who actually enabled Russian aggression. You were sitting on the Intelligence Committee back when Russia invaded Crimea in 2014. What did you do to stop it? What sanctions did you actually push for? What military aid did you authorize? Tulsi leaned forward in her chair. You deferred to the executive branch. That's the same deference you condemned when I said presidents should have to get congressional authorization for military action. So which one is it, Speaker? Should Congress assert its war powers, or should it not? She then pulled out an intelligence document with the blacked-out redactions clearly visible. In my role as DNI, I have now read every single intelligence assessment on Russian information operations. I've been personally briefed by all 18 intelligence agencies, and you know what they say about me supposedly being a Russian asset? She let the silence hang in the air. Absolutely nothing. Because there's no truth to it. There has never been an investigation because there has never been any evidence. It is a smear that you and Hillary Clinton cooked up simply because I opposed your regime change wars. But you know what is in those classified files? Her eyes locked directly onto Pelosi's. There's a lot of interesting information about congressional oversight, foreign policy decisions, and financial disclosures. Should we maybe discuss some of those? Pelosi's hands were no longer casually folded. They were now gripping her armrests. This is completely outrageous. What's outrageous is calling a combat veteran who served 3 deployments a traitor, with absolutely zero evidence. Tulsi cut her off sharply. Her voice was rising for the very first time. Her controlled rage was finally breaking through that military discipline. What's truly outrageous is to question the loyalty of someone who volunteered for a combat zone, while you voted for that very war from the safety of Washington. What's outrageous is you, sitting there in your designer suit, questioning my patriotism when you've never spent a single day in uniform, never heard a shot fired in anger, and never held a dying soldier. She took a deep breath, composed herself, and settled back into that dangerously calm demeanor. But let's just move on from Russia, since we've already established it's a completely baseless smear. Let's talk about something a little more tangible. Let's talk about how you became one of the wealthiest people in Congress while you were supposedly a public servant. And just like that, Tulsi Gabbard dropped the bombshell she had been so carefully preparing. Speaker Pelosi, what was your net worth back in 1987 when you first entered Congress? Pelosi's face became a carefully constructed blank slate. I don't recall the exact figures. Well, public records show it was about $41 million. You were already wealthy from your husband's business and your family's political connections. And what is your current net worth? I'm not quite sure why this is relevant. Over $240 million. Tulsi let that number just hang in the air for a moment. That's nearly 6 times what you started with. And it's relevant because, for 38 years, you've been in control of policies that directly impact markets, entire industries, and even specific companies. And your husband, Paul, just seems to have the most remarkable timing with his stock trades. She then produced a thick folder with documents spilling out across the table. In July of 2022, your husband bought between $1 and $5 million in NVIDIA call options. NVIDIA, of course, makes semiconductor chips. This transaction happened just weeks before Congress voted on the CHIPS Act, which provided $52 billion in subsidies to that very industry. You were the Speaker of the House. You were the one who controlled when that vote took place. Those options were perfectly timed to profit from legislation that you yourself controlled. My husband makes his own investment decisions, Pelosi stated, delivering the same standard line she'd used 100 times before. I am not involved. Let me tell you what I find so remarkable about that particular answer. Tulsi began spreading out the documents like a prosecutor presenting the key evidence. In 2023, your husband's portfolio had a return of 54%. That performance beat every single major hedge fund and every professional money manager on Wall Street. These are people who have entire teams of analysts and decades of experience managing billions of dollars. Yet your husband, who splits his time between making investments and supporting your political career, somehow beats them all. So either he's the single greatest investor in American history, or he's getting information that other investors simply don't have. Document after document was laid out on the table. In December of 2020, Paul buys $1 to $2 million in Microsoft call options. Just 12 days later, Microsoft announces they've won a $22 billion Army contract for augmented reality headsets. Microsoft's stock jumps 11%. Just amazing timing. Also in December of 2020, Paul buys between $500,000 and $1 million worth of Tesla stock. 1 month after that, President Biden announces that the entire federal government fleet will be transitioned to electric vehicles. Tesla's stock soars. What a remarkable coincidence. Summer of 2021. Paul exercises his call options to buy 4,000 shares of Google's parent company, Alphabet, for $2,200 a share. Right when the stock is trading at $2,500, this happens just 1 week before the House Judiciary Committee is set to vote on antitrust legislation targeting big tech. Legislation that, in the end, doesn't pass and doesn't hurt Google. Another absolutely brilliant call. In September 2024, Paul sells $500,000 in Visa stock just days before the Department of Justice announces an antitrust lawsuit against Visa. How did he know to sell right before everyone else did? Tulsi looked up from her documents, her eyes boring straight into Pelosi. So, here's what I really want to understand, Speaker. Does your husband get to see classified intelligence briefings? Nope. Does he sit in on your meetings with industry leaders? Nope. Does he have teams of Wall Street analysts working for him? Nope. So then, how does he consistently manage to beat the market? How does he make these perfect trades just before major government announcements? Announcements that you either have control over or get early access to. Pelosi's expression had shifted from confident to pale, and then to a flushed red. This is nothing but a Republican smear campaign. No, Speaker. These are your own financial disclosures, the ones you are required to file as a member of Congress. I am simply reading from the documents that you yourself filed. No one made any of this up. Tulsi's voice had the calm, unwavering certainty of a prosecutor laying out their case in court. Let's talk for a moment about your stance on banning stock trading for members of Congress. Back in December 2021, you were asked about this very topic. You said, and I'm quoting you directly here, "We are a free market economy. They should be able to participate in that." So that was your official position. Despite the obvious conflicts of interest, the Stock Act violations, and with 70% of Americans demanding a ban, she then showed a video on her tablet of Pelosi's own words, effectively condemning her. Then, the news about Paul's trades broke. The public outrage just grew and grew. And then suddenly, in February of 2022, you announced that you now support a stock trading ban. So what changed? Your principles or your poll numbers? Senator Josh Hawley introduced a bill that specifically called out your husband's stock trades. Originally, he called it the Pelosi Act, to prevent elected leaders from owning securities and investments. The name was deliberate. Now, it's called the Honest Act, and you support it now, after you're no longer Speaker. How convenient, now that you can't control the legislative calendar. Tulsi leaned back, studying Pelosi, the way an intelligence analyst studies a threat assessment. The congressional salary is $174,000 per year. You've served for 38 years. That's $6.6 million in total salary before taxes. Yet, even after adding in your San Francisco properties and Paul's businesses, you increased your net worth by $200 million while supposedly serving the public. The average American makes $50,000 a year. They'd have to work 4,000 years to accumulate what you gained in 38, and you did it while voting on policies that directly affected the very stocks you traded. The air in the room had gone from silent to suffocating. Democrats weren't sure where to look. Republicans were leaning forward like spectators at a boxing match, watching someone get systematically destroyed. Media crews were frantically signaling their producers, because this was not the narrative they'd expected, not the script they'd prepared. "Let's return to Syria, since you opened with that attack," Tulsi said, not giving Pelosi a moment to recover. "You condemned me for meeting with Assad in 2017, called it propaganda, said it legitimized a dictator. Let's look at your Syria record." She produced a photograph, held it up for the cameras. Nancy Pelosi in Damascus, wearing a headscarf, sitting with Bashar al-Assad. In April of 2007, you traveled to Syria and met with Assad. President Bush explicitly asked you not to go. The State Department said it would embolden him. You went anyway. Was that diplomatic outreach? But when I did the same thing 10 years later to explore peace negotiations, that was treason. An edge crept into Tulsi's voice. Here's the difference between your visit and mine. You went to show Assad that Democrats opposed Bush's policies, political theater during wartime, undermining the president. I went to explore possibilities for ending a war and preventing more American casualties. You went for politics. I went for peace. But somehow, I'm the one who's compromised." She didn't wait for a response, her momentum building like a prosecutor's closing argument. "You supported regime change in Iraq, a disaster that led to civil war. You supported regime change in Libya, creating a failed state with open slave markets and terrorist bases. You supported arming Syrian rebels, and those weapons ended up with ISIS. Your policies created the refugee crisis you then claimed to care about. Your policies destabilized 3 countries. Your policies got Americans killed. But I'm the one with bad judgment on foreign policy." Pelosi tried to stand and interrupt, but Tulsi's voice cut right through. "We're not done, Speaker. You questioned my loyalty. You called me compromised. You accused me of betraying my country on national television. So, we're going to have a complete accounting of what compromised actually looks like." She pulled out another set of documents, and Pelosi's face went from flushed to ashen. "Let's discuss your role in the CIA, the torture program. September 4th, 2002. You were the ranking member of the House Intelligence Committee. You received a CIA briefing on enhanced interrogation techniques, specifically on the use of waterboarding on Abu Zubaydah. This is documented in CIA records released by the Obama administration. "I was not told about waterboarding," Pelosi started, but Tulsi was already holding up the document. "This is the CIA memo documenting your briefing. It explicitly mentions waterboarding. Your name is on the attendance list. You were briefed. When the torture scandal broke years later, you said, 'We were not told.' That was a lie. When CIA documents proved you were briefed, you said, 'The CIA misled us.' Also a lie. So either you knew about torture and did nothing, or you weren't paying attention in intelligence briefings about the torture of prisoners. Either way, that's a disqualifying failure for someone questioning my judgment on national security." Tulsi's voice dropped to a colder tone. "America tortured people, Speaker Pelosi. We waterboarded detainees in violation of international law and our own military code. You knew about it. You didn't stop it. You didn't raise objections in classified settings. You only criticized it after it became public and politically safe. That's not leadership. That's cowardice." She stood, and the physical shift changed the entire dynamic. No longer the accused defending herself, but the prosecutor delivering a verdict. "You stand there and question my judgment. You stood by while America tortured prisoners. You voted for a war based on lies that killed hundreds of thousands. You enriched yourself through stock trades while Americans suffered in the recession. You supported regime change wars that created refugee crises. And you have the audacity to call me compromised." Tulsi picked up her thick binder of documents, holding it aloft. "This is the difference between us, Speaker Pelosi. When you accused me of being a Russian asset, you had no evidence. When you questioned my loyalty, you had nothing but innuendo and political attacks. When I make accusations, I bring proof." She dropped the binder on the table with a thud that echoed in the silent room. "Every claim I've made tonight is documented right here. Financial disclosures, congressional records, CIA memos, voting records, news transcripts. Everything is sourced, verified, and a matter of public record." Her voice rose with genuine emotion, her controlled military bearing giving way to the anger of someone defending not just herself, but every service member who'd ever worn the uniform. "I resigned as DNC vice chair to endorse Bernie Sanders on principle. I walked away from party leadership rather than compromise my values. I left a safe congressional seat because I wouldn't stay in a party that became the party of war and Wall Street. I left the Democratic Party when it abandoned working Americans for corporate donors. What have you ever sacrificed for principle, Speaker? Or do you even have principles beyond power and wealth? She moved closer, and Pelosi shrank back slightly in her chair. I've sat with wounded warriors at Walter Reed. I've attended the funerals of soldiers killed in your wars. I've looked into the eyes of Iraqi children who lost their parents in the chaos your policies created. I carried the casualty reports of Americans who died based on intelligence you accepted without question. So when you stand there in your $5,000 suit with your $240 million net worth and question my loyalty to this country, you're not just insulting me. You're insulting every service member who's ever deployed, every family who's lost someone in your wars, and every American who trusted you to serve them while you enriched yourself. Tulsi's voice built to a thunderous peak. You said I'm unqualified to be Director of National Intelligence. Let's compare qualifications. I have a top-secret security clearance that I've maintained for over 20 years. You have stock trades suspiciously timed to classified information. I've served in combat zones under enemy fire. You've served champagne at fundraisers. I've read casualty reports of Americans who died in wars. You voted for those wars and never apologized. I've sacrificed my political career for principle. You've sacrificed your principles for your political career. She stepped back, her voice dropping to a quiet but devastating tone. So here's my question for you, Speaker Pelosi. How dare you? How dare you question my qualifications when your record is nothing but corruption, war votes, and self-enrichment? How dare you question my loyalty when you've used your office to enrich yourself for 38 years? How dare you question my judgment when you voted for the Iraq War, supported torture, got rich while Americans suffered, and sent thousands to die in wars you supported from the safety of Washington? Nancy Pelosi sat in her chair, her mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. For perhaps the first time in her 4-decade political career, the legendary Speaker of the House was speechless. Her hands trembled slightly. Her carefully constructed mask of authority had crumbled. She looked smaller somehow, older, diminished. Not the political queen who'd walked onto that stage, but just another politician caught with the receipts of their corruption spread across a table on live television. Tulsi gathered her documents with military precision, organizing them back into her portfolio. I came here prepared to defend my record. I didn't realize I'd have to prosecute yours, but you left me no choice. When you attack someone's patriotism, their loyalty, their honor, you had better be certain your own house is clean. She looked at Pelosi one final time. Yours isn't, Speaker, not even close. She turned to Jake Tapper, who had been sitting in stunned silence for the last 10 minutes. Unless Speaker Pelosi has any actual evidence to present, any documents showing I'm a Russian asset, any proof I'm compromised? Silence. No? Then I think we're done here. Tulsi Gabbard walked off the CNN stage with the same bearing she'd entered, with military posture, a calm expression, her dignity intact. Behind her, Nancy Pelosi sat surrounded by staffers, whispering frantically, trying to figure out how the interrogation had become her own trial. The combat veteran she'd come to take down had masterfully turned every single accusation into proof of Pelosi's own corruption. And in television studios all across America, producers were on frantic phone calls, realizing they'd just aired something that was about to shatter the internet. It was the methodical annihilation of one of the country's most powerful political figures on live TV, using her own documents as the murder weapon. The moment Tulsi walked off the stage, the entire auditorium erupted. Republicans jumped to their feet applauding, while Democrats just sat there in a stunned silence, looking like people at a funeral who just saw the coffin lid open. Jake Tapper was frozen at his moderator's desk. All his years as a journalist hadn't given him the tools to comprehend what he had just seen. This whole thing was supposed to have been a grueling interview for Trump's controversial nominee for Director of National Intelligence. Instead, it had morphed into the public execution of one of America's most powerful politicians, broadcast live to millions, with her own paperwork serving as the instrument of her demise. Pelosi was still in her chair, now encircled by staffers who had rushed onto the stage the second the show cut to commercial. They formed a tight, protective circle around her, whispering frantically. Phones mashed against their ears as they dialed up party leaders, media contacts, anyone who could possibly help put a positive spin on what just went down. But even they knew, you could see it in their faces, hear it in the slight tremor of panic in their voices, that there was no spinning this. This wasn't some simple slip-up or a bad soundbite. This was a systematic takedown, backed by documentary proof, that unfolded over 90 minutes and was captured by every camera in the room. "Speaker Pelosi, would you like to make a closing statement?" Tapper asked when they were back on the air. And even he sounded hesitant, like a referee asking a boxer who'd just been floored 7 times if he really wanted to keep fighting. Pelosi tried to get up, her hand gripping the armrest for support in a way that made her look every bit of her 83 years. Her professionally applied TV makeup couldn't quite mask the red flush creeping up her cheeks. You could see the tension etched around her eyes and the slight tremor in her hands as she clutched her notes. This was... Her voice croaked. She had to clear her throat and start over. This was a coordinated attack using Republican talking points and distortions. Which part was distorted? The question came from the crowd, from a young woman in the front row who looked like a college student. The stock trades are public record. The Iraq War vote is public record. Your meeting with Assad is documented. So, which part was distorted? Security moved in to hush the audience member, but the damage had already been done. Other voices started to pipe up. Answer about the stock trades. How did Paul know to sell Visa? Why did you vote for Iraq? The crowd that had gathered to see Tulsi get demolished was now turning on the very person who was supposed to be doing the demolishing. Tapper tried to get control of the room again. We need to maintain order. But Pelosi was already making a move for the exit, her staff creating a human shield around her, hustling her off the stage before any more questions could find their mark. The legendary Speaker of the House, the woman who had stared down presidents and commanded legislative chambers, was now in retreat, fleeing, unable to handle any follow-up questions because she had no answers that wouldn't just dig her into a deeper hole. The audience watched her leave in shocked silence, and then one person began a slow clap. That one person became 2, then 10, until a wave of applause washed through the auditorium. But this applause wasn't for Pelosi. It was applause for what they had all just witnessed. It was accountability, served up with the receipts to prove it. Within 10 minutes, Twitter absolutely exploded. Tulsi Destroyed was trending #1 worldwide, except the name in that hashtag wasn't Tulsi, it was Pelosi. The hashtag #PelosiDestroyed racked up 847,000 tweets in the first hour alone. The hashtag #PelosiStockScandal climbed to the #2 spot, filled with detailed threads breaking down every trade, matching them to legislative schedules, and calculating the profit margins. Receipts took the #3 position as people posted their favorite moments of the documentary evidence hitting the table. "How dare you" trended at number 4, with the phrase Tulsi had used becoming a new battle cry. The clips were already going viral on every platform, each one highlighting a different moment of the takedown. Pelosi met Assad too, featured side-by-side photos of both of her meetings. It hit 15 million views in the first hour, and 40 million by midnight. Comments flooded in, all pointing out the hypocrisy. And she did the exact same thing. "And how do you come back from this? How did your husband beat every hedge fund?" The exchange about Paul Pelosi's 54% returns hit 20 million views, with financial analysts jumping into the conversation. "This is statistically impossible without inside information," wrote a former SEC investigator. "We need to investigate this," a sitting congressman added. This is what corruption looks like, coming from a hedge fund manager who'd spent his career trying to beat the market. The full exchange was about loyalty and military service. A clip of Tulsi's voice, rising with controlled fury, as she defended every service member, approached 30 million views as veterans flooded the comments. "That's our lieutenant colonel. She said what we've been thinking for 20 years. Pelosi voted for the war that killed my son, and now questions the loyalty of someone who actually served." But the clip that went most viral, the one that would be studied in political science classes and communication seminars for years, was just 15 seconds long. It showed Nancy Pelosi's face right when Tulsi asked, "How dare you?" The progression from confidence to confusion, to realization, to sheer horror, all captured in high definition from multiple angles, became an instant meme. When the receipts hit, when you realize you messed with the wrong veteran, the exact moment she knew she'd lost. Cable news scrambled to adjust its coverage in real time. Fox News cleared its entire primetime lineup within 20 minutes of the confrontation ending. Tucker Carlson opened his show not with his usual monologue, but with a simple statement. "We're going to show you something remarkable. We're going to show you what happens when a combat veteran with receipts confronts a career politician with accusations. We're going to play this in full, because every American needs to see it." He played 30 minutes of the exchanges uninterrupted, then brought in a panel of military veterans who sat in stunned appreciation. "I served 23 years, a retired Marine colonel said, his voice thick with emotion. "I lost friends in Iraq, and I just watched someone finally hold accountable the politicians who voted for that war from the safety of Washington. That's what leadership looks like." A former Army sergeant, a Purple Heart recipient, added his thoughts. When she said, "I read those casualty reports," I felt that. We all felt that. Every veteran watching felt that, because we've been waiting for someone to say it to their faces. "You sent us to war, and you never apologized when it was based on lies." CN found itself in an impossible position. Their own town hall, their own setup, had just produced the absolute destruction of one of the Democratic Party's most prominent figures. Jake Tapper, to his credit, didn't try to spin it in his post-show analysis. "I've moderated dozens of these events. I've never seen anything like what we just witnessed." Director Gabbard came prepared with documentary evidence for every single accusation Speaker Pelosi made. The financial disclosure documents, the voting records, the CIA memos, those are all public record. I don't know how you walk back from that, but other CNN personalities tried. "This was an ambush," one analyst claimed. "Tulsi Gabbard used her position as DNI to access classified information." "But everything she cited was public record," another analyst interrupted. And the first analyst went silent, because they both knew it was true. The documents were public. The votes were public. The hypocrisy was undeniable. Even CNN's polls, conducted live during the broadcast, told the story. A full 73% of viewers said Gabbard effectively defended her record. 68% said Pelosi failed to address the stock trading questions, and a staggering 81% said they wanted congressional stock trading banned. The network had tried to create a moment that would damage Tulsi, and instead had broadcast the evidence of Pelosi's corruption to millions. MSNBC went into full damage control mode. Vicious, coordinated attack on Pelosi ran their on-screen graphic. Rachel Maddow tried to contextualize it as Republican opposition research, but even she had to pause when playing the clip of Tulsi listing Paul Pelosi's trades because the dates lined up too perfectly. The returns were too consistent. The timing was just too suspicious. These are serious questions that deserve serious answers, Mad finally admitted. And I didn't hear those answers tonight. Joy Reid tried a different angle. This is what happens when Trump appointees abuse their positions. But her own guests pushed back. She didn't use classified information. She used public financial disclosures that we've all had access to for years. She just did the homework we should have done. The Pelosi Stock Tracker website crashed within minutes from the overwhelming traffic. The site, created by a financial analyst tracking congressional trades, had been running for 3 years with modest attention. Suddenly, it was getting millions of hits per hour. The creator released a statement. "I've been documenting these trades since 2021. Everything Director Gabbard said tonight matches our data. Paul Pelosi's returns are statistically anomalous. He was either the greatest investor in American history, or he had access to information the rest of us simply didn't." Financial news networks jumped on the story with the kind of excitement you see when people find a scandal in their own backyard. Bloomberg published a detailed analysis comparing the Pelosi portfolio returns against major hedge funds from 2020 to 2020. The resulting chart was absolutely devastating. Paul Pelosi's performance line soared consistently above every professional money manager, every institutional investor, and every fund with billions in assets and entire teams of analysts. A former hedge fund manager appeared on CNBC to comment, "I've spent 30 years of my life trying to beat the market. I have a team of 20 analysts. We use sophisticated algorithms and have access to real-time data. And yet, this guy, who's supposedly splitting time with his wife's political career, is beating all of us. Either he's a secret genius who ought to be running Berkshire Hathaway, or something else is going on here." News outlets that had meticulously avoided covering Paul Pelosi's trades for years suddenly found they could no longer ignore the story. The Washington Post, after first trying to bury it on page A17, was forced to run a front-page analysis after its own readers demanded coverage. The article, "How Nancy Pelosi Became One of Congress's Wealthiest Members," detailed her net worth increase, the strategic trades, and the timing that aligned with legislative action. And while the article attempted to maintain a neutral tone, the facts themselves told their own story. The New York Times at first framed it as just partisan attacks on Pelosi's record, but had to issue an update when readers flooded the comments with links to the actual documents. Their fact-check article tried to defend Pelosi on some points, but had to rate most of Tulsi's claims as mixed or true because they were documented in public records. Conservative podcasters were releasing emergency episodes within hours. Ben Shapiro titled his "The Day Nancy Pelosi Met Her Match" and played the entire confrontation with almost no commentary. "I don't need to add anything," he said. "The documents speak for themselves." This is what accountability looks like when someone actually does the homework. Joe Rogan texted Tulsi within the hour, "Holy, come on the show. We need to talk about the military-industrial complex. congressional corruption and how you managed to stay that calm while destroying someone. That was the most disciplined performance I have ever seen. Lex Fridman, the AI researcher and podcaster, posted, "This is a masterclass in preparation meeting opportunity." Gabbard had every single document indexed, every response ready, and every counter-argument prepared. This is what happens when someone with military intelligence training enters political combat. The veteran community erupted with a wave of support that went far beyond social media. Within hours, veteran organizations began releasing statements. The Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America said Director Gabbard spoke for every service member who's watched politicians who voted for war, then questioned the loyalty of those who fought in it. The Veterans of Foreign Wars stated, "Tonight, we saw someone defend not just herself, but every single American who has ever worn the uniform." The American Legion simply posted the clip of Tulsi saying, "I read those casualty reports," and added a caption. This is leadership. Even active duty service members, normally cautious about political statements, were sharing clips across military social media networks. One Navy SEAL posted, "This is how you conduct an operation. Intelligence preparation, perfect execution. Overwhelming force, applied with precision. She just taught a masterclass in strategic planning." An Army Ranger wrote, "We were trained to never make an accusation we can't support with evidence. She brought the evidence. That's the standard." Gold Star families, the parents who had lost children in Iraq and Afghanistan, started posting their own stories. "My son died in Fallujah in 2004. Nancy Pelosi voted for that war, and she has never apologized. Tonight, someone finally said what we've been thinking for 20 years. Another wrote, "They called my daughter a hero after she died in Baghdad, but they never held accountable the politicians who sent her there based on lies. Thank you, Director Gabbard, for finally saying it." Across social media, it became a cascade of vindication. Twitter users started digging up old clips of Pelosi defending her husband's trades with increasingly absurd explanations. Facebook groups that were dedicated to congressional oversight exploded with new members. Reddit's political forums were completely dominated by analysis threads. A post titled, "Complete Timeline of Paul Pelosi Trades Matched to Congressional Action," received 47 gold awards and 12,000 comments. Instagram saw a flood of infographics breaking down the net worth increase, the timing of the trades, and the legislative votes. But perhaps the most damaging blow for Pelosi came from what happened in her own strongholds. The Daily Kos, a progressive website that had backed her for years, ran an article titled, "We Need to Talk About Nancy's Stock Trades." Democratic Underground, a site that typically defends party leadership, had threads saying she couldn't answer the questions. That's a problem. Even Pelosi's own supporters were struggling to defend the evidence. By midnight, East Coast time, the political fallout was already cascading. Senator Josh Hawley announced he was fast-tracking the Honest Act first thing in the morning, adding in a statement, "After tonight's revelations, this legislation is more urgent than ever. If there's nothing wrong with these trades, Speaker Pelosi should welcome an investigation. If there is something wrong, the American people deserve to know." Bipartisan support seemed to materialize overnight. Republicans saw a political opening and a genuine policy justification. Moderate Democrats, terrified of being associated with the scandal, rushed to co-sponsor stock trading bans. Progressive Democrats, who had been calling for this for years, finally had the political cover to push harder. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez posted, "We've been saying this about congressional stock trading for years now. Maybe people will listen." House Republicans announced that investigations into Pelosi's trades would begin immediately. "The American people have questions that deserve answers," said the chairman of the House Oversight Committee. How did Paul Pelosi consistently beat the market? Why were his trades so perfectly timed with legislative action? We'll be issuing subpoenas for documents and testimony. The SEC faced public pressure it just couldn't ignore. Former SEC enforcement attorneys were on cable news, saying this pattern of trades warranted an investigation. Securities law experts were writing op-eds. Even the appearance of impropriety on this scale is concerning. The SEC's press office released a terse statement. "We do not comment on potential investigations," which was Washington speak for, "We are looking into it." Ethics complaints flooded into congressional offices. Citizens filed formal complaints, citing specific trades and specific legislation. Legal organizations drafted detailed analyses showing potential violations of the Stock Act. Law professors wrote articles for law reviews. The Pelosi trading pattern was being called a case study in congressional conflicts of interest. The Syria revelation hit foreign policy circles like a delayed action bomb. Cable news started running split-screen images. Pelosi meeting Assad in 2007. Tulsi meeting Assad in 2017. The hypocrisy was visual, undeniable, and meme-ready. Foreign policy experts who had attacked Tulsi were suddenly being asked why they hadn't criticized Pelosi for the same thing. Their explanations, that it was a different context or she had more experience, sounded hollow when both photos showed the exact same thing. An American politician meeting with the Syrian dictator. Conservative think tanks started comparing statements. The Heritage Foundation released a video compilation. It contrasted Pelosi on engaging Assad in 2007 versus Pelosi on Gabbard for engaging Assad in 2019. In 2007, she had said, "Diplomatic engagement is crucial." In 2019, her take was, "Meeting with dictators is propaganda." The contradiction was stark, documented, and irrefutable. Her Iraq War vote, largely forgotten by younger voters, suddenly became relevant again. Anti-war organizations that had been on the margins for years suddenly found their message resonating. They said, "Remember, Nancy Pelosi voted to send Americans to die in Iraq, and she's never apologized." Tonight, someone finally called her out. The torture briefing revelation hit hardest among civil liberties advocates. The ACLU released a statement. If Speaker Pelosi was briefed on torture in 2002 and remained silent, that's a profound failure of congressional oversight. Human rights organizations demanded investigations. The American people were told their representatives didn't know about torture. Now it seemed they did know and did nothing. Democrats in California faced uncomfortable questions at every appearance. Town halls that were supposed to be about local issues became referendums on Pelosi. How much did Nancy profit from her office? Why did she vote for the Iraq War? Will you support investigations into her trading? Progressive challengers started emerging, posting videos of Tulsi's confrontation with captions like, "This is what real service looks like, not enriching yourself for 38 years." Pelosi's San Francisco power base, untouchable for decades, suddenly looked vulnerable. Her favorability numbers in her own district, which were traditionally above 70%, started dropping in overnight polls. Local news stations in San Francisco ran segments titled, "Voters React to Pelosi-Gabbard Confrontation." The reactions were mixed at best, and defensive at worst. "I don't know how to explain those stock trades," confessed a longtime supporter. A Democratic precinct captain said, "I'm disappointed she didn't have better answers." Donors were making calls, and those calls were not supportive. What just happened? How do we respond to this? Should we be worried about our association with her? The machine she had built through 3 decades of meticulous political networking was experiencing its first real stress fractures. This time, it wasn't from Republican opposition, which she'd always weathered, but from her own coalition now asking questions she couldn't answer. The Democratic leadership was in full crisis mode. There were emergency calls among party elders and 3-way calls at midnight, all trying to figure out a messaging strategy that could actually work. Saying we stand with Speaker Pelosi felt wrong when her own supporters were the ones questioning her. Claiming this is a distraction wouldn't work when all the evidence was public record. The line, "We need to move forward," just sounded like they were running away from accountability. Meanwhile, young progressives were openly celebrating. The squad members who'd clashed with Pelosi for years were posting their reactions. "We've been saying this about congressional corruption and endless wars for years. It's about time someone with military credibility called it out." They weren't attacking Pelosi directly. They were too politically savvy for that. But they were amplifying the message, sharing the clips, and boosting the conversation about stock trading bans and war accountability. Moderate Democrats were having a different kind of crisis. How could they distance themselves without looking disloyal? How could they support reforms without admitting they had ignored the problem for years? Their statements came out carefully worded. All members of Congress should be held to the highest ethical standards, without ever mentioning Pelosi by name. They claimed, "We support stock trading bans," without acknowledging they had blocked them before. Congressional oversight is crucial, they'd say, without admitting they had utterly failed to provide it. By 2:00 a.m., Pelosi's spokesperson released a statement that was clearly written by a committee, revised multiple times, and stripped of anything that could be fact-checked and found wanting. Tonight's event was a coordinated hit job by the Trump administration, using distortions and Republican talking points to attack a lifetime of public service. "I stand by my record of fighting for American families, and I will not be intimidated by partisan smears." But the statement landed like a wet firecracker. Social media immediately flooded with responses. Which part was distorted? People asked. The public financial disclosures? You call publicly available documents Republican talking points? You can't distort someone's own voting record. Nobody was buying it. The statement read like standard political spin meeting the immovable object of documented facts. Political operatives from both parties were already writing memos, analyzing what went wrong for Pelosi and what went right for Tulsi. The consensus was brutal. Never attack someone's honor unless your own record can survive the scrutiny. Never question someone's loyalty unless you can defend your own actions. Never make accusations unless you're prepared for them to come back with receipts. And never, ever underestimate a combat veteran who's been keeping score for years. 1 week after the confrontation, Nancy Pelosi still had not made a television appearance. Her staffers were advising her to lay low until the news cycle moves on. But the news cycle wasn't moving on because the evidence was permanent. Financial disclosures don't disappear. Vote records don't vanish. CIA memos stay declassified. Every time a news outlet tried to move on to other stories, social media would resurrect the clips, the documents, and the devastating contrast between Pelosi's accusations and Tulsi's receipts. Meanwhile, Tulsi Gabbard walked into the Pentagon for her daily intelligence briefings, looking exactly like she had every other day, professional, composed, and focused on the work. Her performance as DNI was drawing praise from both parties. Republicans appreciated that she wasn't a Trump yes-woman, but an independent voice, providing unvarnished intelligence assessments. Democrats who had questioned her qualifications now had to admit she was handling one of the most sensitive jobs in government with competence and integrity. Career intelligence officers appreciated working for someone who had actually held a security clearance and understood operational security from military experience, rather than from political calculation. A young Army captain approached her after a briefing at the Pentagon. "Ma'am, I just wanted to say, that CNN exchange. Every service member I know watched it. Thank you for defending us, for showing them what real service looks like." Tulsi's response was characteristically understated. "I didn't do it for recognition, Captain. I did it because someone had to say it. For far too long, we've allowed those who've never served to question the loyalty of those who have. For far too long, we've watched the corrupt and connected enrich themselves while Americans died in their wars. But that all stops when we rise up and speak the truth, backed by evidence, courage, and honor." "Does it ever get to you?" the captain asked. "All the attacks, the accusations, people questioning your loyalty." "Only when I think of all the service members who were never able to defend themselves. I think about everyone who was labeled a conspiracy theorist for questioning the WMD narrative in the Iraq War, only to be proven right. And everyone who was called un-American just for opposing regime change wars. Or everyone who was accused of not supporting our troops simply for asking if we should be sending them somewhere in the first place." She paused for a moment, looking at the young officer who reminded her so much of herself at that age, filled with idealism and a desire to serve something greater than herself. "The attacks don't bother me because I have something that they can never take from me. I know what I've actually done. I know the reasons I deployed. I know the names of the people I read on those casualty reports. And I know that every single decision I make in this position is to keep Americans safe, not to keep myself in power. That is the difference." The impact of that confrontation spread far beyond just one televised debate. It set a new standard for accountability, one based not on political talking points, but on cold, hard evidence. Citizen journalists began tracking the stock trades of Congress members more aggressively, cross-referencing them with the timing of new legislation. Suddenly, the bill to ban stock trading, which had been stuck for years, gained real momentum because voters finally saw a clear reason why it was so important. Progressive Democrats, who had previously been hesitant to challenge Pelosi's legacy, now found the courage to speak up, using that night as proof that even the most powerful figures could be held to account when faced with the facts. Conservative media outlets ran retrospectives, calling it the night Nancy Pelosi's reign ended. Liberal media, on the other hand, tried to frame it differently. Headlines read, "Bitter political confrontation shows division in national security debates." But the average American watching the clips saw something much simpler. They saw a combat veteran with proof confronting a career politician with accusations, and the proof won. The gap between Washington's political elite and the very citizens they were meant to serve had never been more obvious than it was during that 90-minute exchange. The story became a political legend, not just because of the drama, though it was certainly dramatic, but because of how it happened. Tulsi didn't win by using better rhetoric or sharper insults. She won because she came prepared with documents and with the moral authority of someone who had truly sacrificed, not just talked about service. From then on, every political operative started stressing the same lesson. Never attack someone's honor unless your own record is spotless, because if they show up with receipts, your reputation won't survive the facts. Nancy Pelosi had spent decades building her political power through fundraising, mastering the legislative process, and cultivating media relationships. She became the first female Speaker of the House, shattered barriers for women in politics, and passed major pieces of legislation. But along the way, she also gathered a fortune that made her one of the wealthiest members of Congress. She cast votes for wars that resulted in the deaths of thousands. She gave her support to torture. She made herself richer through stock trades that seemed suspiciously timed with government announcements. And she covered it all with the language of public service and patriotism. She made the mistake of attacking Tulsi Gabbard's loyalty, questioning the dedication of a 3-deployment combat veteran who had volunteered to serve while Pelosi voted for war from a place of safety. In that moment, she revealed what happens when real service confronts performative patriotism. It's what happens when someone with actual receipts faces off against someone with only rhetoric. When a warrior meets a politician who has never heard a shot fired in anger. But Tulsi didn't just defend herself that night. She did what millions of Americans had been wanting someone to do for years. She called out the hypocrisy of politicians who get rich while others are the ones serving and sacrificing. The ones who send young people off to war while their own families remain safe. Who question the loyalty of veterans while their own financial dealings raise serious questions. And who claim to serve the public while only serving themselves. That single confrontation completely changed the narrative overnight. Russian asset became combat veteran who brought the receipts. Unqualified political appointment became intelligence professional with 20 years of clearance. And conspiracy theorist became someone who was willing to ask the tough questions that were ultimately proven right. The political establishment learned a hard lesson. You can't just destroy a person by repeating accusations if they have the documents to prove you're wrong, and the counter-evidence to prove your own corruption. Ultimately, Nancy Pelosi had spent 4 decades perfecting political performance, mastering legislative gamesmanship, and building power through fundraising and personal connections. But Tulsi brought something to the fight that Pelosi had never encountered in an opponent. The discipline of a soldier, the training of an intelligence operative, high-level security access, and the moral authority of someone who had actually worn the uniform and seen combat. The Queen's reign ended not because of a better political machine or superior spin, but because of the oldest weapon in a free society, truth. It was a documented, sourced, and irrefutable truth, presented by someone with the credibility to deliver the blow and the courage to stand by it with proof. And that, in the end, made all the difference.